So this morning we will look at aging and nature's intent and anthropology of aging. See, dying, for some people, sadly, it happens suddenly. There's a heart attack, a stroke, or whatever. But that's not nature's intent. We call that an unnatural death. See, the whole idea is you're supposed to age and grow into a certain age, and then aging is part of the process of dying. So I want to look at aging and nature's intent, and I want to do just a number of anthropologies with you. And most of this, a good part of this is going to be secular literature. There's some real wisdom in secular literature, and we'll get more spiritual as we go on. And particularly I want to look at the anthropology of James Hillman, who was a philosopher who just died a couple of years ago. Brilliant Jungian psychologist and anthropologist, and I'm not sure what kind of faith he had. So oftentimes he just talks about nature. He said if you're a believer, you can use God instead. But he wrote a book some years ago called The Force of Character. And not just in terms of the secular world, but also just in terms of religion. You won't read a better book on aging and the aging process. You won't read a more brilliant book and also a more witty book than that one. So I want to begin first to talk about the insights of James Hillman. It'll kind of set the stage for the rest of the day on the aging process. And also he had a great sense of humor. So a lot of this stuff, even though it's deadly serious, he was very, very witty. Okay. So I want to begin with one quote from him, beginning of the book. He says, let us ask why our later years take a certain form and show certain characteristics. Perhaps usefulness needs to be regarded aesthetically. Must the soul be properly aged before it leaves? We can imagine aging as a transformation in beauty as much as in biology. The old are like images on display that transpose biological life into imagination, into art. The old become strikingly memorable, ancestral representations, characters in the play of civilization, each unique, an irreplaceable figure of value. Aging is an art form. Now, he begins with a couple of basic metaphors, okay? Let me give you a couple of more little quotes here, and then I want to give you his metaphors. He says, when it comes to aging, I am led to assume that there's an intelligence inside of life that intends aging just as it intends growth in youth. Psychologists and biologists and so on, they trace out just, biologically how innately we're hardwired, for lack of a better word for that, to grow in certain ways. Youth are going to go through these certain stages and so on. But what Hillman points out brilliantly is that that's also true for aging. There's an intelligence written into our DNA that has to do with both, you're going to see both biology and with spirit, that intends aging and intends the humiliations of aging, just as it intends, the testosterone of youth. And he says, we unfold, both in youth and in aging. It's an enormous mistake to read the signs of aging as indications of dying rather than as invitations to another way of life. And he quotes a Swedish proverb which says, the afternoon knows what the morning never suspected. Okay, great line when you're getting a little older. And then he says, the main pathology of later years is the idea of our later years. It's interesting. The biggest problem with aging is the idea of aging. Okay. He says, wrinkles and creases are not merely signs of aging flesh and drying skin. They display the lines of character. I want to get to an interesting thing here. I know an artist, visual artist, a woman, and she can sit you down, and with about 11 straight lines, crisscrossing, she'll draw your face that people will recognize you, just with straight lines. Okay, sketch artist. But she said, I can't do it for anybody under 40. Said, because they don't have lines yet. Said, under 40, said, I'd need 50 lines to try to make somebody recognizable. Said, if somebody's 90, I can do it with about 7 lines. See, the older we get, the more our character comes out. Remember the great philosopher Sartre says, we form our own faces. And he said, you don't have a face till you're 40, you know. Actually, you have a lot of, oftentimes, biological beauty before you're 40, you know. See, it's a good-looking young person, and so on. After 40, it's not so much, see, your character begins to show through. And also after 40, people are beginning to, what they see is what they get. They can see through you. See, before 40, you know, even if you're spoiled, you're cute. After 40, you're not cute anymore. Okay. So young, oh, he's so cute. Now, she's eccentric, he's nuts, and so on. You know, she's a bitter old woman, and so on. See, after 40, you can't fool people anymore. The lines come out. Notice what he's saying. Wrinkles and creases are not merely signs of aging flesh. You know, they display the lines of character. I love this next line. Then we're going to go into this metaphor. He says, aging deliteralizes biology. It's a great line. Aging deliteralizes biology just when we're most enslaved to it. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. It deliteralizes biology just when you're most enslaved to it. We'll look at that. Then he says, but we don't age easily. He said, we don't let go of either throne or the drive that took us there. Don't feel bad. Nobody wants to get old, okay? He says, the earlier years must focus on getting things done. The later years consider what's been done and how it's been done. Now, he has one really basic metaphor and another metaphor to open this book with. So he starts this book this way. He said, why is it that just when you reach the peak of your mental capacities, just when you reach the peak of actually your human capacities, when you're the most mature, and now you have your life together. You know, remember, as a young Catholic kid growing up with the catechism, we were taught that the age of reason was 7 years old. You reach the age of reason. I'd say like maybe 37, 57, you know, we don't know what we're doing when we're 7 years old, but just, you know, just when you're actually the strongest you've ever been inside of your own person, your body starts breaking down, you know, and breaking down all over. You know, there's the difference between being 65 and younger than 65. Before 65, they say, who's your doctor? After 65, say, who are your doctors? This becomes plural, and you need a bevy of medical people to keep you glued together. You have a doctor for this, a doctor for that, doctor for that, and so on. See, so just as you're getting really strong inside of yours, your body starts breaking down. Well, he says, this is the interesting metaphor. This is his metaphor. He says, the best wines have to be aged in cracked old barrels. You get the metaphor? The best wines have to be aged in cracked old barrels. The breakdown of the biology, okay, is what is seasoning and maturing the soul and bringing out its character. And he's going to trace that out in great detail. See, he said, aging deliteralizes biology, ironically, just at the time you're most enslaved to it. Just in the time when you got to see doctors and be taking pills, and, you know, or you're in assisted living or whatever, you're enslaved to your biology, your aging process is deliteralizing that and taking you away from it. See, and you're going to see when we look at Kathleen Singh, she talks about how, you know, that's calibrated to bring you into the realm of spirit. Okay, so that's his basic metaphor. You know, basically it moves you from biology to soul, and it's opening you up to the other world. He also said, it's interesting, it reverses the law of the universe. Remember, Charles Darwin said the law of the universe is survival of the fittest. Aging puts you into survival of the weakest, the gentlest, you know, the most helpless, which is also the gospel. Remember, Jesus wasn't born in the world, God wasn't born in the world as a Superman. God was born in the world as a helpless baby, completely helpless and vulnerable. See, Christianity reverses the evolutionary thing about survival of the fittest. We're into the survival of the weakest, the most vulnerable, the poor, you know. The gospel of Jesus is about the poor. Okay, that's his first metaphor. His second metaphor isn't important, but it's very, very colorful. And it's very helpful today in the sense that he said, what's the usefulness of old people? Why do we have people in seniors' homes and people with dementia who are still alive and so on? He says, our society's failure to understand this is precisely our society's failure to grasp character. It's just some colorful expressions. What's the value? Imagine a family and they got the grandfather living with him. And he's semi-dementia. He's got a cane. You got to stay away from him half the time, you know, and they got to adjust all kinds of rhythms to him and so on. He said, what's the value? I said, well, Hillman said, he's like an old stone in a river. The water's got to go around him. You got to adjust all your rhythms around Grandpa and so on. He said, but he gives the family character. A big stone in a river gives the river character. Smooth waters, smooth sailing, no character. You know, and today, as we shunt more and more, we simply put seniors into seniors' homes, we become poorer as a culture for that. You know, I lived in Italy for 6 years. In Italy, there are almost no seniors' homes. You take care of your mother and father till they die, and it makes it more of an intergenerational thing. There's something healthy. And even when they're semi-dementia and so on, there's a whole formation of character that happens with that. And the purpose of age, they're an art form. They're ancestral representations, you know. And today we don't grasp this anymore. Later on, I want to talk about, euthanasia and so on, and how we just totally don't get it when we talk about Christ's passion and so on. You know, we have we're sincere, but we no longer grasp other forms of very important utility. We just don't grasp it. And this is one, you know. Well, why should older people be around us all the time? So there's these basic metaphors. Now, so remember he says, the best wines are aged in cracked old barrels. Now he's going to trace this out. What are the cracked old barrels? And then he has 8 chapters. I'm just going to go very, very briefly. And they're all brilliant. And he takes one aspect of aging and he shows how it deliteralizes biology and then forms soul. And you're going to recognize all of these. So the first one, he says, why do our bodies sag in old age? You know, some of this is just gravity. The older you get, the more gravity takes its course, you know. I saw a colleague of mine the other day I was in the seminary with, and he said, you know, he said, I'm still exactly the same weight that I was in the seminary, except it's all in different places. Okay. It's just all sunk a lot lower. Okay. Now, why do our bodies sag in old age? Now, listen to that. Each time I'm going to give you one colorful clip from Hillman. He says, the old should be stooped. They should carry the weight of the planet for the young. When a body begins to sag, it's abandoning its sham and its hypocrisy. The body leads the way down, deepening your character. Your body doesn't know how to lie. Aging makes a metaphor out of biology. The organic changes are part of poetic speech. So when you're carrying the weight of the world, you better be stooped, you know. He said, and also your body at a certain point, see, when we're younger, we can do sham, we can do hypocrisy, we can get away with makeup and do all kinds of stuff and tummy tucks and a few things. At a certain point, it just doesn't work anymore. And what we are is out there, and biologically, it's no longer the beauty of the young. Poetically, it's powerful. You know, it's like that artist says, I can't draw people under 40. I can't get a face. They don't have one. Give me a 90-year-old and wham, you see something. See, they're an art form, okay? But it deliteralizes biology. Secondly, I love this one. He has a whole chapter. You know, when you get older, and looking at the room here, I'm not sure if you're all in that stage yet, but you can reach a stage where you can't sleep through the night completely. And you have to get up at night to take a pee, okay? So he said, why is that? No, he said, well, he said, it's brilliant. He said, that's nature and God. He said, nature and God is turning you into a monk, okay? He said, monks have secrets that are worth knowing, except we don't know them. But what monks do is this. Monks, in a lot of monasteries, they set an alarm and they get up. during the night, and they hold a prayer service they call vigils. I've lived with Trappists lots of summers and so on. So you get up 4 o'clock or wherever, you get up and you have a prayer service for 40 minutes in chapel, and you pray there in the dark. I said, well, why don't they do it during the day? Sleep through it. I said, no, there's some wisdom to that. So when you get up at night to go to the bathroom, you come back to sleep, but then you can't fall asleep immediately, okay? And then he says the goddess of night, and the goddess of night is called Nyx, N-Y-X. You got to know who the goddess of night is. She comes around your bed with all her children, and her children are called grudges, anxieties, bitterness, and so on. And you have to deal with her because you won't deal with her during the daylight hours. See, when it's daylight, we can push a lot of stuff away. I was just at a conference the other day of a brilliant speaker at a school, and she says, like, I get up at night now, why does it always happen at night that I feel all these anxieties? And I thought, because the goddess of night is visiting you. See, you can't do that in daylight hours. The night speaks to you in a different way. So he says what's going to happen, since we're not monks, nature's going to turn you into a monk before you die, conscriptively. And not just with that. You know, if you live long enough, you know, monks take 4 vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, and stability, okay? You live long enough, you're going to conscriptively get all 4 of those vows, you know. You know, you're going to get stability. It's called assisted living. Okay. And when you're in assisted living, you're under a strict vow of obedience. Okay. Your life isn't your own. Your car keys have been taken away. Your independence has been taken away. And at that age, oftentimes, chastity is also an imposed thing, you know. And oftentimes poverty, a certain poverty follows, you know. You want to see poverty go to a senior's home. You know, great little quip I heard some years ago from my provincial. He said he was home visiting his parents, and they were 79 and 80. He said, but still pretty healthy. And they were sitting at table, and he said his dad was lamenting about the day's going to come when they have to go into assisted living. And his mother said, for you it will be no adjustment whatsoever. Said most men have it most of their lives. So notice again how biology is developing your character. See, so it makes you, it forces you to do this, to think more deeply. Then he said, our sexual lives must change. How? Well, there's really a great line here. He says, the strength of this character, or our sexual change, lies less in controlling lustful fantasies than in understanding their transpersonal nature as a cosmic dynamic. Let me read that again. The strength of this change lies less in controlling sexual fantasies than in understanding their transpersonal nature as a cosmic dynamic. You know, if you study the dynamics of sexuality, you'll see that sexuality is very, very developmental. And oftentimes we don't understand the later stages of this developmental process. See, so that, you know, prior to, let me just trace this out very quickly. See, prior to puberty, we're sexual, but we have a containable curiosity. You know, little kids, they're little, they just know there's something out there. But their sexuality hasn't constituted yet in their consciousness. So that's why little kids are so alert to everything, you know. They're walking around, they're picking up a marble, and they're looking here, and they can learn languages and so on. And then puberty hits, and it kind of knocks out your consciousness for the next 80 years, you know. And then, you know, the sexuality, and initially in puberty, it constellates very, very strongly biologically, you know, and sexuality is a lot about sex and so on. And then it evolves healthily into the desire for intimacy. But then that desire for intimacy, that itself evolves out to a desire for generativity, for children, and so on. But that's not where sexuality stops. That's not its highest expression. Those of you who are grandparents, that's its highest expression. You know what the highest expression of sexuality is in this life? Is an elder, a grandparent, looking at a grandchild and saying, God, isn't this kid beautiful? See, and those of you who are grandparents, you know that. They say the deepest experience of love on this whole planet is not, in marriage, it's grandparenting. And those of you who are grandparents, you get it. See, your love is pure, and then see, when you're looking at your grandchild, say, God, isn't this kid great? That's God looking at the world at the beginning of creation and saying, it's good, it's good, it's very good. It's the Father looking down on Jesus at his baptism and say, this is my beloved in whom I take delight. See, so that what happens is, and today we're trying to, delay that through Viagra and all kinds of other things. But see, your sexuality, it biologically deliteralizes, as Hillman, and it becomes what it should be. The highest expression of sexuality is people looking, is the grandmother or grandfather or the elder, the aunt at a barbecue looking at the family saying, it's wonderful. The kids are enjoying themselves. See, that's the highest expression. And your biology forces that on you, or at least it opens you to it. Okay. Then he says, why do the senses seem to dull in later years? When sensation isn't so strong. Now he says this, sensation is just as strong, but it is now detached from the physical senses. It is more literary than literal. See, so as you grow older, you basically, your soul, your body is forcing your soul to become more poetic, to see more in metaphor, to see more in image. And so your senses seem to dull. Not, they don't get dull. They're just forcing you to see it in less biological ways. See, you're deliteralizing biologically. Then he says, why the propensity for heart failure in later years? So we get older, a lot of people have heart trouble. Okay, why? Well, he says this. Could these reoccurrent fears of acute heart failure reflect other, more chronic failures of the heart? When you have physical heart condition, could it reflect some other failures of the heart? He said, could heart troubles in later life also refer to a troubled heart? As you lie rigid in your bed or stare out over the water, the heart reenacts how you betrayed your friend 40 years ago, how you played the evil sister, the negligent daughter, the shrinking friend. You see clearly and feel fully the injuries caused to spouses, parents, lovers, partners, dependents strewn in the wake of your self-centered demands and delusional beliefs. So he said, your heart begins to give you physical trouble to wake you up to what where your heart has not been faithful in life. Then this next one, he says, why does it happen? It doesn't happen in everybody, but it happens in a good number of elderly people where they'll go through periods where they seem to push the young away, so that I've seen it. When I was provincial, our provincial aid was attached to our seniors' home. So I ate meals with the retired guys every day, went to mass with them and so on. And you'd see some stuff, at the time I didn't understand, where you'd have seen a brother or something who was so gentle and so wonderful and so on. And then they're in assisted living, and at a certain point, not all the time, but they can become very grouchy. You go and say, I don't want to see you. I don't want to see anybody today. And they just push you away and so on. And it's kind of surprised, or the nurses would tell all kinds of stories that, you always go in there, make sure you have your battle armor on. You never know how this old guy's going to react and so on. Now, there's a reason for that. Why? Because at that age, there's a certain inner work that's required that demands precisely that you can't be with the young. Now, I'll give you a powerful example of that. A friend of mine is a doctor, woman, and she tells this story. Said when she was a little girl, 11, 12, 13 years old, her mother made her do candy striping. I don't know if they still do candy striping, but where you go in and you get to play nurse on a Saturday morning, and they put a little uniform on you, and basically you're like an orderly. You carry water and bring stuff to people and so on. So during one period of her candy striping years, she was assigned for a month or two to every Saturday morning to spend an hour with this, let's call her Mrs. Smith. There was a Mrs. Smith, and And she was in her 90s. She was semi-dementia, but still kind of functioning and so on. And she'd have to spend an hour with her. She'd come in and kind of get you some water. Sometimes she'd read to her, help her find something on television or whatever. So she said one morning she came in on a Saturday morning, and Mrs. Smith was sitting and looking out the window. And she said, "Good morning, Mrs. Smith." No response. "Can I do anything for you?" No response. "You want a glass of water?" No response. "Do you want me to read to you?" No response. So she sat for a while and read in a chair, and then she did again, "Can I do anything for you?" Just no response. The woman was sitting looking out the window. So finally, mercifully, the hour was up. She says, "The hour is up, Mrs. Smith. I need to go." She says, "Can I do anything for you?" And nothing. And said, "I'm leaving." And then Mrs. Smith turned and looked at her. And said, she turned and she said, there was a strange feature to her face. A strange look. Said, "I'd never seen that before." It was kind of, I don't know what. Said, and I left. This woman became a gynecologist. And said, "I never saw that look again till I delivered the first baby." She said, when babies come out of the womb, when they open their eyes, that's the look on their face. Pardon me, I missed the point. She says to Mrs. Smith, "What were you looking at for so long?" And Mrs. Smith said, "I was staring at the light. I was looking at the light." See, she was preparing herself. She's looking at a different light. And sometimes, see, a young person is simply a distraction. Sometimes the old want the young around because for all kinds of reasons we want to still feel this youth and so on. But there'll be certain times where we just say, no, right now I don't need a distraction. I don't need the young. There's some inner work that your biology is forcing on you. Okay. Looking at the light. Then, I like this one. Why does our skin dry out? The older you get, the drier your skin gets. Okay. Again, just a quote. He says, "Archetypally, youth is moist. Old age is dry. But damp is heavy. It bogs you down. It pulls down. It's messy. Dryness illuminates. It burns away what's extra. It makes us light, purifies, clears away mess, and ultimately yields the dry salt of wisdom. Old age, dry wit, dry humor, dry eye, a chance to become pure flame." You get the image here? These are powerful metaphors. He says, youth, it's damp, it's moist, it's heavy, but you're trying to fly away. You got to dry out. Then finally, the last one, I love this one. It says, why do we become muddled in old age? Where at a certain point, things aren't always clear. We have all these jokes we tell about, just a couple of these and so on. I tell a story. A priest friend of mine tells this one. He says, it's 4 elderly men. They're sitting in a senior's home, and they're lamenting about their declining age, of the declining health. And the first man said, God, it's so terrible. He said, I can't see anymore. I can't recognize a face that's 6 feet away. The second guy says, my doctor says I'm a walking heart attack. He said, I shouldn't be driving. I could just, anytime I'm gone. And the third guy said, I'm suffering from osteoporosis. He said, and I can't turn my head even a fraction to the right or to the left. I'm just ossified like this. And the fourth man said, but thank God we can all still drive. Okay. Well, why did we become a little more muddled in old age? Well, listen to this line here. He says, the muddle reflects the merging of things into a more complex and richer image. Like an ancestor, you are beginning to grasp the world less personally and more in essentials. See, youthful thinking is sharp thinking, but sharp thinking oftentimes is not compassionate, it's not widely, it's got no nuance, it's black and white and so on. The older you get, the more the edges blur because they're supposed to blur. The great mystics like John of the Cross and so on, they said, the older you get in the second half of life, you're supposed to enter much more into unknowing than into knowing. One of John of the Cross's famous lines is this, the older you get, he said, the more, he said, learn to begin to understand more by not understanding than by understanding. See, when we're young, everything is too clear. That's why politics in this country isn't working anymore. Everybody's really sure of their position, which is the opposite of this position and so on. Nothing can work. Everything is clear and hard lines and so on. You get a little older, you realize there are no hard lines. This is, light is darkness and darkness is light. Give you an example which I always use in my class. Imagine somebody comes up to you and says, I've known you for 60 years, 50 years, and I understand you, I know your family, I know who you are, you're an Irish Catholic and so on, and you're just like your mother, and I know your Myers-Briggs number, I know your Enneagram number, and I know all your personality. I understand you. Do you feel very understood? No, you feel violated, okay? See, they got all these boxes and categories, and you're understood and so on. Imagine somebody comes up to you and says, I've known you for 50 years, and you're a mystery to me. You continually surprise me. See, then you feel understood. See, they're moving more into non-understanding. The older you get, the more you should say, I don't understand anything anymore at all. And it's wonderful. Because it's opening and widening the mind, When we're young, crisp, clear ideas, I got it. And that's why we don't get along with each other. That's why our politics doesn't work. That's why religions fight with each other. Because our ideas are precisely too clear. Get a little older, say, remember a great line that Raymond Brown, the great scripture scholar, gave us once in class. Raymond Brown said, he said when you're young, he said, you should be causey. You should be out there with placards and protesting for this and so on. He said, when you get to be about 70, he said, park all your placards in the closet. He said, bring out a basin and towel and begin to dry people's feet. He said, see, that's the movement of, the lines aren't there anymore. There's not a time to push a placard in somebody's face. It's a time for a wider heart, a wider understanding. And since we don't do it, so notice, since we don't all these things naturally on our own, nature forces them on us. I'm going to make you open-minded against your will. By simply, muddling your mind and taking away those clear edges. See, that's all under that central metaphor that he has where he says, the best wines have to be aged in cracked old barrels. See, as the body breaks down, it's deliteralizing biology just when you're most enslaved to it, as he said, and it's moving into the realm of soul. Let's look at a couple of others. That's Hillman. Now, next, I want to talk a little bit just about Hinduism, the stages of growth in Hinduism. Hinduism is older than Christianity. And Hinduism has a highly developed spirituality and a highly developed kind of spiritual anthropology, which we can learn a lot from. But Hinduism says that there's 5 stages to life, and you'll see that the first ones are pretty clear. So they say these are the 5 basic kind of primordial stages to life. First of all, infancy or childhood. You're born, you're a child. And they said it's pretty clear. The purpose, little kids are supposed to learn a language, learn to function socially, and little kids, their job is to play. Little kids should have toys and play. Okay. So then you graduate into being a student. And for them, a student isn't just going to school. Okay. A student is all the years you're preparing for life. You're preparing for a career, you're preparing for marriage, you're preparing for, take religious vows as a sister, or you're preparing for your job, you're preparing professionally. All the years from your little child, from the time you start school, till you get married and have a job and so on. Those are the years you're a student. You're preparing. Then you become what they call, I like this expression, a householder. See, a householder. Now you have a house. And oftentimes you have a spouse, you have kids, you have a mortgage, you have a car, you have jobs, you have all these responsibilities. And that might take the next 40 or 50 years of your life. You're a householder. That's what we call the generative years of your life. Those are the years where you're in charge. You're raising the kids, you're paying the mortgage, you're teaching the kids, you're doing this stuff. Okay? But unless you die of a heart attack or something in between there, that's not the end of your life. They said you shouldn't end your life as a householder at a certain point you should become what they call a forest dweller. And this is a stage we haven't developed in Christian spirituality. They said you should, right about the time you become a grandparent and so on, they said, at that time, I'm going to look at that much more in depth this afternoon, spiritually. It's a time for us to ideally stop being deliberately generative and try to do something else with our life. But you don't know what to do, so forest dwelling, that's an archetypal image. You're supposed to go into the forest and be instructed by the elders. You're forest dwelling this morning, you know. So you're supposed to start taking courses in spirituality and so on. Say, what am I going to do with my retirement years? Just buy golf clubs and go to Florida and golf? You know, remember a line from Jerry Seinfeld? He said, my parents moved to Florida. He said, they didn't want to, but they turned 70 and that's the law. Okay. Okay. So, no, see, today, given contemporary health standards and medicine and so on, you know, everybody's living a lot longer, or most people are. And so a lot of people reach 70 and 75 and they're wonderfully young and healthy. They're going to live another 15 or 20 or 25 years, okay? What are you going to do with those years, you know? See, what are those years for? Now, we've never had a great spirituality. I'm going to talk about this afternoon. What should be the spirituality for those later years? Golf clubs? Or just taking care of your grandkids? Or whatever? See, well, the Hindus say since we don't know, that's when you should be going back to school. The same as we have universities to prepare you for your career, we should have universities, forest-dwelling schools that prepare you for retirement. You should go back now and take a 3-year degree on what do I do in retirement. You know, the same as you took 3 or 4 years of a degree to, I'm going to become this, I'm going to become that. They said, you know, we need to have forest-dwelling schools. You need to go someplace and be apprenticed. You know, they said otherwise, as we'll see this afternoon, all we do is we just keep repeating over and over again our generativity till a stroke or a heart attack or something takes us out of action, you know. They said, and with the idea being that that's a temporary phase. You prepare for retirement, then you become a sannyasin. And a sannyasin is a holy old beggar, you know. See, their idea is you're supposed to, you come into this life poor, you're an infant, you're a child, and so on. And then, you know, you prepare, and then for a while you help run life on this planet. But then you're supposed to disappear. You're supposed to just, you know, become some holy beggar, and you have to figure out what that means for you. We're going to look at that a little bit this afternoon. What does it, how do you become a holy old beggar in our culture? What does that mean? What can it mean? And so on. So that you're no longer, you basically dethrone yourself from the center of life and you take yourself to the edges. And we struggle to do this. You know, in the early church, if I can just throw in one thing, in the early church, it used to be quite popular. Now, you probably don't want to hear this. I'm not advocating you do it. But oftentimes when the kids were growing up, the man and the woman would retire to separate monasteries. He'd become a monk and she'd become a nun. And they'd live out their lives then as, say, you know, we've done our generative years and that was their way of becoming a holy beggar. You know, you literally became a monk or a nun, you know, in old age and so on. See, that was their way of doing it. So we have to say, since we don't do this, how can we do this today? That's part of the afternoon's agenda. How do you become a holy old beggar? How do you become a sannyasin? But see, in Hinduism, again, aging is meant to take you eventually out of the generative field, and you become generative in a different way. You spend some years learning what it means for you, and then you become a holy old beggar. You know, just as a footnote, a couple of years ago, we started and we kind of lost momentum, but it was started by the Mary Knoll Fathers and so on. They got a lot of religious groups together, men and women, and we were having these seminars on this. And part of what we were trying to lead to is that we would try to set up some of these forest-dwelling schools. You know, we'd buy an old convent, you know, that holds 80 people, and you'd put a faculty in there, and retired people could come there, like a little university, and do forest dwelling for a couple of years. Like, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? Now that you're 75, but you're wonderfully healthy, how do you instead of buying the golf clubs and moving to Florida or Phoenix, what do I do now? You know, see, we do need forest-dwelling schools. We haven't got any. Okay, that's Hinduism. Let's take a couple more. Germaine Greer. I'm not sure if you know who Germaine Greer is. She's Australian originally, writes out of England. One of the strong original feminists, you know. Wasn't always so popular in religious circles, and kind of unjustly. She's written some deep books. Some of her first books were a little bit too colorful and a little bit too strong, but then she wrote some very mature books. And one of her very mature books was called The Change, okay? And it's the story, it's her idea of the stages in a woman's life. It's a brilliant book. It's already 25 years old and so on, called The Change. And she said, these are the stages of a woman's life. So you have infancy and childhood. It's pretty clear. You know, you're born, you're a baby, and you're a young child, and so on. She says, then you enter the age of adolescence. Says, and in Western culture, she's writing from a strongly Western culture, says, and you enter the time of, she calls it nubility, not nobility, nubility. See, that's when you're the young, wonderfully looking, bodied young girl, you know, and you're drawing attention on the street, okay? Says, and then you marry, you become somebody's wife. And then you have kids and you become somebody's mother. So you move wifehood, motherhood. She said, and then sometime in your 50s, the change happens, and the change is menopause. You know, when she says the change, it's a book about menopause. She says, and then she says, for most women, it's going to hang them out to dry. Because if you look at all those stages, adolescence, wifehood, motherhood, said you're valued for your biology. You're valued because you're young and good looking. You're valued because you're a wife. You're valued because you're a mother. Notice they're all biologically based. And then when you're 50, your biology does this cruel trick on you, and it hangs you out to dry. Says, and then your place in society is no longer to do with your biology. Says, and a lot of women just really, really struggle. It's interesting. She makes an interesting point here. She says, Catholic sisters. Now she's not a Catholic. Says Catholic sisters are the best equipped for that, because they already made those vows in their 20s or so on, where they said, I'm not in this primarily for my biology. So they don't have to make that adjustment. They've already made it at age 20. So, but for most women, it catches them, and it's unconscious. This, you know, and oftentimes it leads to anger and so on. And she traces out some, this is just for interest's sake, some very interesting things. She shows, for instance, how in literature, you know, in literature, if you read literature, you have no women heroines after 50. You know, in Hollywood and so on, you know, you can be the Hunger Games, Jennifer Lawrence or whatever. You can have women heroines, but not after 50. You have men heroes after 50, but no women, see? So that she says, or also she says, she's talking about herself, she says, when you're a young girl, you're too visible, you know? People are whistling you at work sites and all kinds of stuff and so on. You're talking, get lost and so on. Then when you become 50 or 60, she says, you can't get service in a restaurant. They don't see you. Said, haven't you been served? They notice you after 20 minutes and so on, you know. But she says, see, this is an opportunity. It's much like Hillman. She says, this is an opportunity where you move towards more a different type of meaning and soul. And she dusts off an old archetypal word, and she tries to reinstate it. Do you become a crone? See, today the word crone has an old crone. No, crone is a good word. Crone is like Sophia. See, a Sophia is the woman wisdom figure. You know, Sophia is just the more beautiful title, you know. See that you become the wisdom figure. You become the elder. You become somebody who trucks and does stuff in soul. You now become a soul instructor for people. You become their soul companions. Before that, you were a biological major. Now you're a soul major, you know. And that's what, the same as she said, Hillman, that's what aging intends. Aging intends that you do some really powerful, important things biologically. You know, she says a woman up to to menopause, and then afterwards, now you're meant to do some important soul things. You know, it's interesting, and she does a little bit of that, but you can do some very interesting studies, which I wish I'd done more of, because it's very rich. And that is how different cultures sometimes ritualize this. So, for instance, in Greece you can become a widow even before you're a widow. You know, see that the word widow doesn't mean your husband died. The word widow means that you're taking a social stance. And so in Greece, if you become a widow, at a certain point a woman can say, you know, all this sexuality and beauty and cosmetics, I'm out of the game. I don't want to play this game anymore. So she dresses in a black dress. You know, it's almost like a nun's garment. See, she puts on a, quote, quasi-religious habit. Then she walks the streets. She's perfectly safe. Nobody's going to touch her, and so on. And, you know, of course, you know, she's no longer, nobody's going to hit on her, but nobody's going to ask her to marry her. She's saying, I'm out of it. I'm moving towards something else. I'm becoming a Sophia. I'm becoming a crone. I'm no longer interested in all this, the games we've played up to now, or the life as it up to now. See, you become a widow, which is actually what religious sisters do. And that's why they always have the religious habit. You put on a habit, you're declaring yourself a widow. I'm not in this normal game. There's normal life, and I'm not playing that game anymore. So you don't have to buy makeup anymore. You don't have to worry about dyeing your hair or anything. Just to, I'm living for a different purpose now. Not that the other purpose is bad. You know, biology keeps the planet going. You know, but this is a powerful book. Very, very powerful book for women. You know, coming from, again, from a secular source. When church people write this stuff, they always say, well, that's what church people say, and so on. I like it when you get it from major, powerful secular sources, where Germaine Greer says, you know, like, part of your life is about biology, but as you age, your biology itself is going to force you into a change. That's her image for menopause. Menopause is the change, and it's a big change. Because again, it starts deliteralizing your biology and pushing you into soul. Do one or two more and we'll stop there. Richard Rohr. Many of you are familiar with Richard Rohr. Now, Richard has great categories, and Richard always brings together the spiritual, the psychological, everything together. But I love this. I'm going to just give you one piece from Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr said, when you get to be 60, whether you're a man or a woman, he said, you're standing on the same plateau. Now, men and women get to be 60 in a very different way. You know, when they trace out kind of the spiritual and heroic and whatever life journey, you know, women have a different ethos that they do this under and so on. And men always have somehow this epic hero thing going and so on. So we kind of get to 60 in different paths. Said, but when you're 60, he said, we're all standing looking at exactly, we're on the same plateau, looking at the same future. And this is the future. He said, you have three options open to you at age 60. Okay? He said, you can become a pathetic old fool. Okay. Now, a pathetic old fool is an old person who's trying to be young at all costs. You know, more hair dye, more tummy tucks, more this, more that, more something, you know, and for a while it works, but then after a while it just doesn't work anymore. You know, you can't fool people and fool your own body indefinitely. He said, and then the efforts become pathos. See, pathetic comes from the Greek word pathos, which means it's painful. You know, like you're trying to do it, but you can't do it, you know, and sometimes you see it, it looks pathetic. I remember once standing on a street corner with some friends of mine, and this man drove by, and he was probably 75 or 80 years old, and he had a huge sports car with, you know, some kind of rock music blasting with a ponytail, and he was trying to pick up people. Someone said, I think he's past the time. You know, there's something pathetic about, you know, if I'm 78 years old and I'm trying to be 25, you know, the sports car, the hair, this, that, the rock music, and so on. You know, there's something pathetic about that. Okay, now, he says, most of us won't go that route. He said, most of us, we have neither the talent, nor the money, nor the energy to go this route. He says, so what happens is we become angry old fools. So we become an angry old fool. Now, that isn't abstract. You know, when you go to seniors' homes and you're around aging, there's a lot of anger. We'll look at that later on this morning, just disappointment in life and so on. And so that we become angry at the young. You know, today's kids, they're all spoiled and this is all nonsense and so on. You've heard the lines, see. So it's an old person who's angry, okay? Or he said there's only one other option. You can become a holy old fool, okay? Now notice, you're going to be an old fool in any case, okay? That part is non-negotiable. So, but am I going to be pathetic? Am I going to be angry? Or am I going to be holy? You know, I've seen some holy old fools. You know, remember when I was provincial, we had a priest, French-Canadian guy, who had gone blind, been a missionary for years up north. And there's a wonderful gentleness to him and so on. And he'd say Mass. He could do it by memory. He'd have somebody else read the gospel parts and so on. And whenever he'd do our daily Mass, we'd get a little influx of people into our little chapel and so on. And his homilies were always the same. He'd sit down in his chair for homily. He says, you know, he said, God loves you. God loves you. And you know what? Everybody would start crying. You know, Mother Teresa used to do that. Mother Teresa was a holy old fool. She'd walk into a room of 10,000 people, an auditorium. She's going to give a talk, you know. And she says, God loves you. And everybody would start crying. I've tried that a few times. It doesn't work. That kind of thing. If you get nothing to say, get off the stage, you know. See, then the language and everything becomes just absolutely simple. You don't hardly need any words. Everything just carries, it's powerful, you know, that the more, when somebody's a holy old fool, just their presence and so on, it's just powerful. There's a holiness that it's a tangible, intangible, an intangible, tangible, pardon me, and so on. You know, I've seen it with Mother Teresa. I saw her once in an auditorium in Edmonton, the Butter Dome at the University of Alberta, and probably 15,000 people. And little Mother Teresa walks in, and they introduced her, and there's a hushed silence. And she comes out on the stage and is very gentle, says, God loves you. There were tears all over the auditorium, you know. Now, don't try this at home, you know, unless you truly are a holy old fool, you know. See, that's somebody who's beyond bitterness, beyond pathos, and so on. And Rohr, and so much of Rohr's theology and spirituality is geared to bring you there. All of his stuff on the second half of life, to let go, to shed, and we're going to look at some of this, to let go of things, to shed things, so that at a certain point you are this holy old fool. Okay, one more, and then we'll take a break. And that's Alice Miller, the famous Swiss psychologist. Alice Miller, who has since died, was a Swiss psychologist who 50, 60 years ago wrote a very, very famous essay. It's a small little book, famous essay called The Drama of the Gifted Child. Okay, and in it, this is her thesis. The gifted child is not some child that's born with an astronomical IQ, you know, or they're very gifted in talent and so on. For her, the gifted child is the sensitive child. I would suspect most of you in this room are gifted children. So the gifted child is the child who wakes up, the young girl who wakes up to consciousness, and she's really sensitive. She's nervous that she's not pleasing her mother. She's nervous she's not pleasing the teachers. She's nervous that she's not pleasing her church. She's always trying to measure up, never quite good enough, and so on. See, the giftedness is the sensitivity. And so she becomes this really good young girl who, you know, is good at school and doesn't act out and pleases mother and goes to church and does all these things. Says, and then the drama happens in midlife. Then when you get to be 35, 40, all of a sudden some of this stuff starts backfiring. And you're saying, you know, I've done all this to please mother and to please my parents and to please the church, and I got married too young and it's not who I am. So, and then a lot of times there's a lot of backfiring. So then what happens is, and with many people it doesn't happen sometimes till they get into midlife and old age, that we start getting angry. And a lot of resentments. Your wounds start breaking through, and you start realizing that you've been wounded, you haven't been loved properly, you haven't been valued, and so on, and so on. And then a lot of anger begins to break through. So Miller says the task of midlife and beyond is the task of grieving. Said you have to grieve, she said, until the foundations of your life shake. Says, and then you can age into mellowness. So that otherwise you will age into anger or into pathos. See, taking up from Richard. Richard says you can be a pathetic old fool, an angry old fool, a holy old fool. Alice Miller says unless we deal with our wounds, says the entire spiritual task and psychological task of midlife and beyond is grieving. And those wounds are there, you know. So it's not a question of are you wounded, only where are you wounded. And the wounds are irrevocable. It's like if you fell and broke your arm and your arm has got twisted or something, it is there. You just have to deal with it. So, and dealing with it means grieving. So, and you can become a happy, wholesome, holy person, but it's predicated on grief. It's predicated on letting these wounds go. We'll talk about that later this afternoon. Just the ultimate thing in life to let go of anger, to move to gratitude and forgiveness. During the first hour, we looked at the process like aging has its own intent, you know, with that great metaphor, but the best wines have to be aged in cracked old barrels. During this next section, I will look at, I'm calling it dying's intent, or aging and dying as calibrated to bring us into the realm of spirit. Aging and dying as calibrated to bring us into the realm of spirit. So this is intermediate between aging and death. I want to begin with a few quotes, and then we want to go into analyzing this. This comes from a woman called Amanda Bennett. She says, "We have a narrative for fighting death, but we don't have a narrative about letting go." Now, this comes from Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner says, "In dying, we must let ourselves sink away into the incomprehensibility of God." We must let ourselves sink away into the incomprehensibility of God as Jesus did. Not in bitterness, in grasping or anger, but in trust, gratitude, and forgiveness. We'll look at that. We need to let ourselves sink away into trust, gratitude, and forgiveness. Eddie Hilson, a wonderful Jewish writer who died in the Holocaust, she says, "The important thing is not to survive no matter what, but the important thing is what meaning can we give to our lives." Dag Hammarskjöld, "Do not seek death. Death will find you, but seek the road that makes death a fulfillment." Seek the road that makes death a fulfillment. I want to enter this, the idea that aging and dying are calibrated to bring you into the realm of spirit. I want to enter through the works of one great writer, very important writer, Kathleen Dowling Singh. Kathleen Dowling Singh. And she's a hospice worker. She's not a theologian. She's not a medical doctor and so on. She's a hospice worker, and she has worked with hundreds, not dozens, hundreds of terminally ill patients in hospice. Okay? She wrote a book called The Grace of Dying. She also has a book called The Grace of Aging, but I want to focus on her book called The Grace of Dying. It's a stunningly deep and a stunningly important book, The Grace of Dying. And this is her basic thesis, the same as Hillman's thesis, which we saw, is that aging is designed to mellow your soul. Kathleen Dowling Singh says that the later stages of aging and the process of dying is, and she uses the expression, exquisitely calibrated. It's exquisitely calibrated to bring you into the realm of spirit. Okay, and she writes both theoretically, and she's got training in both religion and psychology. She writes as an academic, but she also writes as somebody who has sat for hundreds of hours with different people dying and so on. And the book is very encouraging. If you struggle with your faith and your fear of death and so on, you want to read this book, For instance, she says in virtually every case where she has sat with terminally ill patients and so on, that the moment of their death was actually a moment of ecstasy, and we'll look at that. Now, this is her thesis. Catherine Dowling Singh said, right now, in fact, she says, we've created our own fear of death. Our fear of death is self-created, okay? And it works this way. She begins the book with a quote from William James, the great psychologist. And William James said that, he said there are all kinds of realms of reality and realms of consciousness that we're not conscious of. See, right now our consciousness, we're conscious and we're self-conscious, but it's a very narrow little field that we can think about and imagine and so on. Okay. And she said, let's go back prior to that. She said, take a baby. I love this expression. When a baby's born, a newborn baby is sitting on its mother's lap, says, and the baby is, I love the expression, the baby is luminous. So this baby is just this wonderful little luminous person, but the baby can't think. See, so the baby isn't self-conscious yet, and so on. But yet because the baby isn't self-conscious, it's actually connected to everything. A baby's consciousness is just this wide consciousness, except it's not self-consciousness. A baby is aware of everything, and ironically kind of aware of nothing because it can't think. It has no self-consciousness. So we have to develop a self-consciousness, and we do it through stages, okay? See, and we do it through what she calls making contractions inside of our mind. See, a baby has no contractions yet in its mind. So it has no self-consciousness, but it just sits there, it's just aware. It's just drinking in reality. And reality's wide. We don't drink in much reality at all. We're only aware of certain things. So we form our self-consciousness this way. She says, the first stage, and psychologists, this is Freudian, it's Jungian, it's no psychologist is going to challenge that. The first stage is we make a contraction where we separate ourselves from other. See, a baby, at the stage of a baby, it can't even distinguish itself from its mother. So it's the mother are kind of one, and that's why it cries when the mother leaves the room and so on. It has no sense that this is mother and this is me, or this is other and this is me. But then, it's what Freud called the mirror stage. At a certain point, some months into the baby's life, at a certain point, the baby will recognize that its self is a self and that's other. And oftentimes that's what Freud called the mirror stage. One day the baby looks in the mirror and laughs because he realizes, that's me. Before it couldn't do that, See, and that's a powerful realization that, I'm me and that's other. I'm me and that's mother, and so on, and so on. But to do that, the baby has to contract. It already puts a kind of like a layer around consciousness. Its thinking is going to be less wide. It's made that it's a dualism. So now you have your first binary, your first dualism. There's me and there's other people, okay? It's already a slimming down of reality, okay? Then, at a certain point, the baby will make a distinction between life and death. This is alive and this is dead. See, people are alive, plants are alive, insects are alive, a stone is dead, there's dead people, there's live people, and so on. See, that's another major contraction. So now it's slimming this consciousness down, and so on. So it's more aware. See, as you become more self-aware, you become less aware. See, so now there's a second dualism. There's a second powerful binary in the kid's life that, there's me and there's other people. There's dead things, there's live things. Okay, you're already contrasting. Then at a certain point, the baby will make a distinction between its mind and its body. That comes to the third stage. Right? This is me thinking, and this is me feeling, and now I'm eating, and now, that. And after a while, the baby's really clear that there's this third dualism between mind and spirit. I mean, mind and body, spirit and matter. This is hard stuff. This is what people think, and so on. And again, that's another, she calls that a contraction. You're contracting your thinking, okay? And then there'll be a fourth one. And the fourth one is the one that's more recognized, in psychology and so on. And that is the baby will separate it'll separate itself from its own luminosity and shadow. See, what happens is, for instance, as Christians, but you can do this without using Christian terminology, but I'll use Christian terminology. We are made in God's image and likeness. And that isn't to be conceived of as some kind of icon painted inside of you. You have divine fire. There's a goddess, there's a little God inside of you, and you have this powerful luminosity. You have powerful feelings and appetites and so on. You know, St. Augustine, you've made up for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Okay? So we have this powerful luminosity, but we can't handle it. We can't handle the dark parts and we can't handle the light parts, so we split it off. That's what Jung called the shadow. You know, we only deal with the parts of that we can handle. You know, give you an example of how this works. Freud used to say, you see things, you understand things well by when you see them in their pathologies. You know, when you see something broken, you see how it's constructed. Break a crystal glass, you'll see the structure of crystal. But see, you understand this sometimes in brokenness. So one example is, for instance, when people cut themselves, which is a pathology. You know, there's people who are in deep psychological pain, and the way they handle it is they cut themselves. They take knives, and you know, not to die, just to make themselves really hurt, and to create wounds on their body. And so you could ask, like, why would anybody ever do that? No, you don't have to be a major in psychology to understand that. It's simply, that means they are hurting at some really deep place, but they can't look at that place. So they'll hurt themselves at a place where they can look at. See, if you cut yourself, it's a wound. You can deal with that wound. It's there. You put Band-Aids on it, you put ointment on it, and you get stitches if you need it, and so on. See, so you make yourself hurt at a place where you can look at. And then you don't have to look at that place where you can't look at. See, that's your shadow. It's part of your luminosity. And part of the shadow isn't just negative. Part of the shadow is the negative parts we can't look at, that we don't want to deal with. And then also it's the powerful parts of ourselves that, you know, that our luminosity, that they're too good to deal with, you know. And oftentimes later on we're going to see it comes out as rage and anger and so on. There's a part of you, there's a goddess inside of you, you're a woman, there's a God inside of you, you're a man, who's never really had much scope to operate on this life. And you've got that, and you know what we call the word denial. Oh, I'm not, you know, I'm this and that and so on. You know, whenever somebody says, it's a kind of false humility where somebody says, you know, I'm nothing. You know, I'm just this little piece of humble excrement, and you know, that's always a complete lie. And whenever somebody says that, you'll always find a really enraged person underneath, because we aren't that. You are God's image and likeness, you know, and this stuff needs to come out, you know. But see, we can't handle it, so we bury it, we bury it. You know, it's interesting, you see it come out in great people. You know, when you look at great people, Mother Therese, or like John Paul and so on, sometimes it's stunning what they can say with a straight face. You know, for instance, John Paul could stand in front of the whole world and say, I love you, and it's very important you hear that from me. You and I can't do that, our tongue would break off. It's saying, hey, who the hell am I to stand in front of, you know, or Mother Teresa walking anywhere. I'm a very important spiritual figure, and she was, you know. See, they could release a lot of their luminosity without it destroying them. Sadly, oftentimes in rock stars and athletes and so on, they release that luminosity and it destroys them because they identify with them. That's why Michael Jackson, Amy Winehouse, all these rock stars, and Janis Joplin who die, and Whitney Houston and so on, feel sorry for them. That these are powerful people, you know, with powerful energy, and that energy comes out and they can't handle it. I remember once seeing a wonderful interview with Janis Joplin, the rock star, and someone says to her, what's it like being a rock star? She said, it's terrible. She said, you have no idea. She said, have you any idea what it's like to go in front of in a stage and make love to 20,000 people and go home and try to sleep alone or sleep at all? See, their luminosity comes out. See, you know, we have ours capped, you know, and that's why we're very sane, solid, you know, sane, you know, consciously impaired people, you know. See, so that there's parts of our energy we can deal with, and parts of our energies, both positive and negative, we can't deal with, so we just seal them off. Notice it's a contraction. I'm not looking at that. I'm not going there, you know. Now, of course, it's going to affect our lives. You know, John Powell, the Jesuit, not John Paul, but John Powell, you know, you have this great image. He says, you know what we do so often with stuff we can't handle? He said, imagine you're living in a house and you're living on the first floor, and every time you can't deal with something, you open the basement door and throw it into the basement. Shut the door. Out of sight, out of mind. What's going to happen? Pretty soon it's coming up through the vents. This stuff is fermenting. See, that's our shadow. And there's rich stuff there. There's negative stuff. There's positive stuff. But we seal that off. And then we're sitting in this room now. We have a nice working consciousness. You know, we're aware of certain things and we can control certain things and so on. And we're sane. We're balanced. We have a strong self-image. I mean, we have a healthy self-image. We're balanced. But to do that, we've made 4 major contractions of our consciousness. And that makes us into strong, healthy people. Okay, now, Kathleen Dowling Singh says, what the aging process does, and then particularly the dying process, it breaks down those 4 contractions. And it does it in exact reverse. So when you watch somebody die of terminal illness, or you watch someone in a senior's home, we'll look at that, what it does is it breaks down those 4 contractions in reverse. It's going to first break down your shadow, then it's going to break down the distinction between body and mind, then it's going to break down the distinction between life and death, and it'll break down the distinction between self and other, and so on. And this isn't abstract. It's not, remember Hillman kind of hinted at that. He said, why does our mind get muddled when we get older? Because it starts breaking down. Those distinctions aren't there, and so on. So that as we get older, the process of dying breaks this down. Let me give you an example. It's an earthy example, some years ago, I went to the funeral of one of the fathers of one of our priests, okay? And he died at age 90, okay? And he had been a really strong man, good man. He had raised a large family, he had run a successful company, and because he was a kind of a natural leader, he was always in charge of stuff. Every place he went, he was the president of this, the head of that, put in charge of the parish council, he was a natural leader who took control of a room, and he was a good moral man. Strong, but sometimes too strong. So he died at age 90, and his son, who was one of our priests, preached at his funeral. Great homily. He began the funeral this way. He said, Scripture says 70 is the sum of a man's years, 80 for those who are strong. He said, now our dad lived to be 90. He said, why the extra 10 years? He said, well, it's no secret at all. He said, he was simply too strong and cantankerous to die at 80. He said he'd have been fighting with Peter at the front door. You're running this wrong, Let me take over. I'll show you how you should be doing this stuff, and so on. He said he was too strong a man. And he wasn't talking physically to die at 80. He said then he lived 10 more years, and during those last 10 years, he suffered a series of massive diminishments. He said his wife died, he never got over it. He had a stroke, he never got over it. This happened, he never got over it. He said by the time he died at age 90, he could take your hand and say, help me. He said he couldn't say that since he was 3 years old. He said if he had 87 years of his life where he was in control, But when we're in control, we only see certain things. He said by the time he died, he could put out his hand and say, help. He said he's ready to go to heaven. Because actually the only condition to go to heaven is surrender, Just, we don't have to do it. God puts us there, but we're always fighting. We're fighting, See, now, the process of aging and the process particularly of dying is calibrated to break down this. But as Kathleen Dowling Singh said, it also brings it into the realm of spirit, Let's look at that. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did the first major studies, and she was kind of, in some sense, is still the textbook, the Bible of the science of dying. But remember, she said these are the stages, You see a doctor says you have terminal disease. First there's going to be a stage, there's going to be denial. He said, no, it's not going to happen. I'm going to fight it, and so on, and not. The doctor's wrong, and false diagnosis, and you fight, and so on. So denial. Said, and then at a certain point, denial doesn't work anymore, and you break into anger. Why me? It's not fair, and I always took care of my health, and so on, and I still have so much to live for, and it's not fair, and so on. So you break into anger. But the anger eventually lets go, and then you get into bargaining. Well, at least one more year. Or if I can get 9 good months, or I can wait till my daughter's wedding, or I'm going to wait till my son graduates, or till these come home. So you're bargaining and you're already negotiating for time. And then eventually you have acceptance. Now, Kathleen Dowling sings that when you watch terminal people die, there's other stages. She said Elizabeth Kubler-Ross doesn't go far enough at all. She says, you have the classical denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. Except when they accept it, they still haven't accepted it. They think they have. She said, but after, beyond acceptance, she said, not with everybody. She said, some people, the acceptance stage, and they stay there, and they can die at certain serenity. She said, most people don't. She said, most people, and this is helpful to know sometimes if you're sitting with dying people whom you know and love and have deep faith and so on, and you'll see them go through this. It can be very confusing. She said, some of them will enter into a stage of despair. She said, and then after despair comes surrender. She said, and then after surrender comes ecstasy. Let me tell you that this can be very confusing. Iris Murdoch once said, she says, a common soldier dies without fear, but Jesus died afraid. Why? That's quite a line. She said, a lot of people die, not afraid at all. And here's Jesus, the ultimate spiritual figure. Jesus died afraid, crying out. Looks almost like despair on the cross. Story on that. One of the great spiritual figures, the last half of the last century, was Henry Nouwen, the Dutch writer, taught at Yale and Harvard and so on. And he wrote a book after his mother died, wonderful book, and it was called In Memoriam. And he describes his own processing of his mother's death. He was from Holland, but he was teaching at Yale at the time this happened. And he says, he said, my mother was the most deeply Christian, spiritual woman I'd ever met. He says, my mother prayed every day of her adult life to Jesus. She said, I want to live like you. I want to die like you. I want to be just like you. She said, and she meant it. So he's teaching at Yale. He gets a phone call from his family. Their mother's dying. So he gets on a plane, flying to Amsterdam. Said, and on the plane from New York to Amsterdam, he's fantasizing how this is going to work. It's going to be her mother's great last testimony to the family. She's going to hold all their hands and bless them and tell them how wonderful Jesus is and how unafraid she is. And it's going to be this great last blessing. It didn't happen like that at all. He comes home and here's this deeply Christian, faithful woman, and she dies in agony, seemingly without faith, crying out and so on. And he said it just completely discombobulated him. He said, like, how could this be? That his mother with this deep faith, and then she dies like that, And he said until he was thinking afterwards, that, it made sense. That she prayed every day to Jesus, I want to live like you, I want to die like you, and he heard her prayer. That's the way Jesus died. Socrates died in serenity and so on. Now, said, why wouldn't, we always say that for instance, when they discovered the diaries of Mother Teresa, and they found out during the last 60 years of her life, she had no felt experience of God whatsoever. And people say, how could that happen to her? Time magazine said, was she an atheist? How could this happen to her? Well, that's not an understanding of spirituality at all. The real question is, why wouldn't that happen to her? She's a spiritual athlete. Mother Teresa was the person who prayed and said to God, give me your best shot. Just give it to me exactly as Jesus experienced it. So he did. You got to be careful what you pray for. There's actually a cheaper version of Christianity where we think that by putting on Jesus, we're going to get this easier walk through life, and other people get sick and you won't, and you're going to die with serenity. Look at Jesus, not the way it happened. Daniel Berrigan, who just died, one of my favorite clips from him, and Berrigan always had these laconic, expressions, crisp, and at one point he says, before you put on Jesus, consider carefully how good you're going to look on wood. Okay. Because you look at the way God handled Jesus, that's the way Jesus will handle you. Okay. Now, Dowling Singh says, in her dealing with dying people, she says, normally this is the cycle. they know people dying of terminal diseases, they've worked through this Elizabeth Ross stages. That's earlier, long before they're in hospice. They've done the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the kind of surrender, okay, I'm ready to die. But we aren't really ready to die. Most people, there's going to be another stage. And partly it's brought on by the biology of those last moments. So they're in pain and they're gasping for oxygen and they're on morphine and this is happening and so on. So it looks like they're in despair, like this kind of despair. But she says, then beyond that, she always sees a stage of surrender. So I've seen it in every dying person I've been to. There's a certain stage of surrender, says, and then after surrender, says, there's always a stage of luminosity and ecstasy. She says, most people die, terminally, said, they're dying in ecstasy either in the last minutes or the last hours or the last seconds before they die. And she even charts examples. Steve Jobs, the inventor of Apple, he died of pancreatic cancer. And they said when he was dying, in the last minutes, he began to say in the room, this is wonderful, this is beautiful, oh, this is wonderful. And he wasn't talking to anybody in the room. It was the breakthrough, So see, what's happening in the dying process breaks those 4 contractions, And then you have the luminosity of a baby, and again, they're looking at the light, There's the Jobs that says, this is just beautiful, this is wonderful, and so on. She doesn't do much of this, but she could. But there's a whole literature. In fact, there's almost a library of literature now of people who have been clinically dead and then have come back. And some of you had, in fact, there's this movie out now based on, 90 Minutes in Heaven, if any of you saw this and so on. This stuff isn't just fanciful stuff, In fact, we have thousands of documented cases now of people who were clinically dead and came back to life. And in every case, they didn't want to come back. In fact, I shouldn't say in every case. The only cases where they wanted to come back was where people had committed suicide. They wanted to come back not because because they wanted to come back and redo that. It's not the way I want to exit the planet, But everybody else did not want to come back. And if you saw this movie, 90 Minutes in Heaven, the guy was in a complete depression for 2 years because he lived, He had spent 90 minutes in heaven and come back here, and so on. Now, some of that literature, have to read it with a bit of a critical eye, but there's so much of it. But Kathleen Dowling sings. She doesn't write as, she is a Christian, and she's religious, there's a Buddhist part to her and so on. But she doesn't write particularly as a religious. She writes as a health worker who has just sat with hundreds of people dying. And she says, I reiterate her phrase, she says, the dying process is exquisitely calibrated to bring you into the realm of spirit. So, see, it deliteralizes your biology. It takes you away from the body. And the breakdown of the body, breaks down those contractions of the mind. It said it opens you up. And people actually die in ecstasy in the seconds before, sometimes in the minutes before, in a few cases in the hours before. I remember some years ago reading the last conversations of Therese of Lisieux, what do they call it, little flower. Okay, see, and she had 4 of her sisters in the convent with her. Okay, and so they were charting her every move as she's dying. They're writing down every word and so on. And she was dying of tuberculosis, so she was asphyxiating. So it said she was in great, great agony the last days and hours of her life. And then just in the seconds before she died, her face burst into just a complete ecstasy, and she died that way. And when I first read that, I thought, well, that might be a little bit of hagiography, the sisters. But after reading Kathleen Dowling sing, who's never heard of Therese of Lisieux, says, that happens. That happens. Not necessarily in that, explicit a form, but she says, people die. She says, and I like that. She says, read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she takes you to the door of hospice. Then once you get into hospice, there's 3 more stages, and they have a happy ending. She says, then you move from acceptance back to non-acceptance. You move to a certain despair, to a certain pain, and so on. And then after it said, and then what's deeper than acceptance is surrender. It says, then you surrender, says, and then there's ecstasy. because you've left the realm of biology, you're now in the realm of spirit. And she said, The Dying Process, it's a powerful book, and very, it's a book that'll help your faith, you know, and it'll take away some of your fear of dying, you know. And she says the fear of dying, it's self-created. She said, with these contractions, you know, at a certain, I mean, we're biologically hardwired to resist death, you know, but that's an instinctual resistance, not necessarily a fear. This whole thing about what's going to happen, and so it says that is from these contractions we make. So, and then see, then the aging process already begins to blur them and break them down. So then the dying process does it completely. I saw an interview with her on television recently, and someone said, well, what about people who die suddenly in car accidents or heart? And she said, well, she said, I don't know. She said, I suspect the same thing happens, but in a different kind of form. She said, she said, my work is based on people dying the natural cycle, where you die from disease and old age and so on. It's interesting. Let me go a little back and do a little footnote on this man dying, where this man says, our father, took God 10 years to mellow him out. Many of you in this room are Roman Catholics, okay? And as Roman Catholics, we believe in something called purgatory. Now, if you're a Protestant, you're really lucky. You don't have to believe in that. I was thinking of becoming a Protestant just so I wouldn't have to do purgatory. Okay? See, and Protestants have always resisted purgatory because they said, you know, like Scripture says there's only two places, heaven and hell, and they're right. As Catholics say, where do we get purgatory? Well, it's a proper understanding of purgatory. Purgatory isn't a place distinct from heaven and hell. Someone says, do you believe in purgatory? I say, absolutely, you can film it. Okay? Go to any senior's home, and let's just trace it. So we're going to call the woman Martha. Martha, when she's 92, she falls, and then she has to go in assisted living, and she lives another 6 or 8 years. And during that time, she loses everything. She loses her hair, her teeth, part of her mind, her friends, and so on. And by the time Martha dies, she's lying in a bed. Most of her possessions are in a little box in a cabinet and so on. She's an eschatological fetus. She's completely ready to be. She's just undergone purgatory, you know. See, purgatory isn't punitive. It's not some punishment for your sins. Purgatory is the purgation. That's exactly what Kathleen Dowling is describing. You know, the process of aging. Most of us in this room, we're undergoing purgatory. Okay? You're losing your health, your vigor, your hair, your teeth, your dignity, and so on, your place in society. That's purgatory. It's getting you ready. You know, there's this famous line from Job, the book of Job, and Richard Rohr uses this line a lot when he talks about stages of life, where Job says, you know the line. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I go back. Okay, now, you can write a whole anthropology and spirituality on that. Naked we come from our mother's womb, not just that we don't have any clothes on. We come out of our mother's womb, we have nothing. We don't have a name. We don't yet have anybody to love us. We don't have a language. We don't own a thing on the planet, you know. And then they begin to clothe us, and then we begin to take on a lot of clothing. Then you learn a language. First you get a name. Then you learn a language. And then you learn how to, they toilet train you, and you learn how to say please and thank you, and you get to be a kid, and you have your own toys, and so on. And then you begin to go to school, then you really accumulate. Then you get an education. Then you graduate from grammar school, and then from middle school, then from high school. Then you go and get a university degree, then you get another university degree, and then you get a really good job, and then you get married, and then you buy a house, and you buy a car, then you buy a second car, then you have children, then you have grandchildren, you have a cottage by the lake, you have books all over and stuff stored in your garage, and you have a safety deposit box, and you have money in the bank, you have all this stuff, and so on. And that's all good, okay? Except none of it is going with you. So you see, in the first half of life, and the first half of life isn't just the first 35 years of your life. You know, in spirituality, that means till we get to this, where we're looking at aging and retiring and so on, is a lot about accumulation. That's good, you know. Naked you came from your mother's womb, and then you take on clothing, And then the rest of the year, see, your aging process is going to be all about shedding this. By the time Martha dies in the old senior's home, she's met on a will, all of her stuff goes to somebody else. She hasn't got a place in society anymore. She hasn't even got her own dignity. Sometimes hasn't even got her own mind anymore. Okay. And then, see, she's ready to die. Naked she came from mother's womb. Naked she goes back. You know, there's a wonderful book, I'm just tipping you off on different literature and so on, by Mary Gordon, the novelist from New York. She wrote a book about her mother called Circling My Mother. And her mother dies of Alzheimer's, of dementia. And she talks about her journey with her mother, you know, as a young daughter, traveling with her mother and visiting her mother as her mother goes through these stages, you know. And, you know, partly it's very sad and partly it's funny sometimes. It's just she came to the hospital one day, or the hospice, not the hospital, the senior's home, and her mother didn't recognize her, you know. So they're talking for a while, and finally her mother says, well, who are you? She says, well, I'm Mary. I'm your daughter. I said, you're my daughter? I said, yeah. I said, doesn't it mean I had you? I said, yeah, you had me. Her mother said, well, you can't be expected to remember everything you've ever done. You know? Okay. See, but her mother is going through a purgative stage that's exquisitely calibrated to bring her into the realm of spirit. See, that's purgatory. Now, I want to talk a little bit in the time we have left about our struggles with that. You know, the literature, if you read like John of the Cross and some of these writers, they'll tell you what your struggles are going to be when you reach there. There's definitely want to say that we haven't got a lot of literature on dying, spiritual literature. And the reason we haven't got it is because up to now we didn't need it. People died real young. You know, now when people are living to be 80, 90, and 100, we suddenly need a spirituality of aging and so on. But John of the Cross, who wrote on that years ago, he said, these are the issues you're going to be facing. You know, I'm going to name them more than explain them. He said, first of all, there's going to be a lot of disillusionment and disappointment. See, as we age, you know, there's up until a certain age, we're a promising young person. And you still have your dreams, you know, what you're going to accomplish, and so on. And there's a time where mortality begins to set in. We just realize this is as good as it's ever going to be. You know, this is the best I'm ever going to look. This is the most I'm ever going to achieve. This is the healthiest I'm ever going to be, and so on. And there can be none of us meet our dreams. And see, that's also where part of our angers and frustration and stuff sets in. You know, I'm dying, and I haven't had a complete life. That's in some ways true for most people. I'm dying, I'm fading away, society's not giving me a place anymore, and I never achieved a quarter, a tenth of what I wanted to achieve, you know. And oftentimes that's an unconscious thing, and we just swallow it, and we become, you know, semi-comatose, just sit in chairs and watch football, and I don't care about anything anymore. That's disappointment, it's a disillusionment, and so on. Then, in some of us, it comes out positively, more positively, not positive in moral sense, but that there's positive anger and resentment. You know, resentment that the young, jealousy of those who have achieved, you know, my mother loved my sister better, and that's why she got the university degree, and that's why she wrote the book, and mother loved her better, and there's anger and so on, okay? And then also a combination of boredom and rage. It's interesting. Boredom and rage have the same root. And boredom and rage are always rooted in our image and likeness of God. See, you have, why are we ever bored? You know, life seems interesting because you're hardwired for everything. And there's just little things happening in your life. And oftentimes, it's either boredom, rage comes from the same sort of where, you know, we haven't achieved, we feign humility. Well, I'm really this humble person. We're not. And underneath, there's just a raging goddess or God who's just angry that nothing we wanted to accomplish in life really happened, that we're living small lives when we're big people inside, and so on. And then with that often comes a reluctance to bless the young, other than a few like our grandchildren and so on, so that, see, the task and that's a separate talk, but the task of old age, as we're fading into the horizon, is we should be fading to the horizon just blessing the young, handing off to the young. Let me give you two archetypal examples of that. Excuse me. King Herod. If you want the bad example of everything, look at King Herod. That's written up in and contrast him to the three wise men or the three good kings. Luke wrote that, and it's a powerful archetypal story. So it said, Jesus is born, and word goes out, a king is born. There's a new star in town. So how do they react? The three wise men, and they're elders. See, there's a magus. The magus is the Sophia. That's the elder person. We always call them three kings, but they weren't kings. They were wise men. They were elders. They were Sophias and so on. These were elders. So they hear this king is born. So what do? They travel. They follow the star. They travel from a distant land, and they come and they lay their gifts at the foot of the child. And then what happens to him afterwards? We don't know. There's all kinds of legends, and the legends aren't helpful. The whole idea is they're never heard from again because they don't want to be heard from again. See, they have dropped their gifts at the foot of the young, and they say, now we can die. Now you can buy golf clubs in Gulf and Phoenix and so on. The world's in safe hands. You've given your gift to the young. The task of aging, the spiritual task is not just as Alice Miller says, to grieve our wounds. That's to make us healthy. The healthy task is to bless the young. You got to be riding off in the sunset, telling your grandkids and other kids, and telling the world how wonderful it is. And that's hard to do because we're bitter, we're disappointed, and we have every reason to say this world is going to hell in a bucket, and youth are bad, and then there's cell phones all day, and they're all superficial, and they're idiots, and on and so on and on. No, that's bitterness. God is still looking at this world and saying, it's good, it's good, it's very good. This is my beloved child in whom I'm well pleased. Now, contrast that to King Herod. King Herod hears the star is born, so what's King Herod's response? I'm going to bless the child. I'm going to kill him. And to make sure he gets him, King Herod kills all the boy babies in all of Bethlehem and surrounding area. Okay? You can write an anthropology off that. Fish aren't the only species that eats their young. See, Herod's threatened. There's only room for one here, so he tries to kill them all. Okay? That's the opposite of blessing. But you know how we do that? The great temptation as we age is to start killing people. Except we don't send out soldiers with swords, You know how we kill the youth? And this is going to be, hopefully they won't censor this out of the tape. We do it this way. You say, just wait. Young person, full of life, full of energy, just wait. When he puts up with all the bullshit I've put up with for 30 years, he's going to be as jaded and as miserable as I am when I'm old. See, that's the way we treat our young. Instead of, we treat them precisely by not blessing them. Just kind of wait. See, we don't pause and kill them. I'm not going to encourage this person. We meet it with cynicism. When she puts up with all the nonsense and garbage that we put up with, when she's my age, she's going to be just as miserable as I am. Okay. See, that's King Herod. That we're killing the young people around us. Okay. Last point. I want to talk about a happy death. This afternoon, I want to really focus it on Jesus and how we give our death away. But we're meant to die happy. When I was a kid, I don't know if Catholics do this anymore, but when I was a kid, we used to always pray for a happy death. Some of you will remember that. And you know how we fantasized a happy death. So we had a certain catechetical fantasy of a happy death, and it worked this way. That a happy death would be this. They always use this kind of fantasy. There was a man, and he drifted away from the church, and he drifted away from religion, and he drifted away from morality, and he became a drunkard, and he became an adulterer, and all this stuff, and never went to church. And then he's moved in a moment of grace, and he goes back to church. He goes back to church, and he goes to confession to a priest. He makes a good, sincere confession. He receives communion, and he walks out of the church, and he has a heart attack, and he dies, I mean, what a wonderful space to die. He had been 40 years in not a very good situation. Now, he does this, and bingo, he dies. It's happy death. And then the reverse. You have somebody who's really a good person, you know. She's this wonderful woman, and she's been dedicated and so on. And one night she just loses her temper, and she throws a couple of pots and pans around, and you know, and hollers at her husband, stamps out of the house, and gets drunk and dies under a bar stool. And said, well, she died a bad death. You know, neither of them has anything to do with a happy death. See, a happy death, not whether death catches you on an up bounce or a down bounce. You know, caught the first guy on an up bounce, caught this poor woman on a down bounce. So that's not nothing to do with a happy death. That can have to do with consolation for the family. You know, I know people who their last moments were in great moments, where somebody precisely hollered at his wife inside of a good marriage. And they were married for about 30, 40 years and so on. And in one moment of anger, he just hollered at his wife, went out and slammed the door and got hit by a car and got killed, you know. So her last memories of her husband are of anger. No, but they had a happy marriage. It was a down bounce, you know, and what a cruel thing for him to do. You know, should have died at a different time, you know. She should be angry with him for dying at just that point. But that's nothing to do with God. Okay. To die a happy death is to die in honesty. Ruth Burroughs, the great British Carmelite writer, who's somewhere in her 90s now and still going strong. And in her autobiography, which is a marvelous little book called, you know, Before the Living God, Ruth Burroughs says this. She says, I once lived with a nun, said, who as a nun, as a Carmelite nun, said she was a thoroughly mediocre nun. Said she was a pleasant person to live with, but she was an airhead, and she liked community, didn't like silence, didn't like prayer. She liked to be at table and doing stuff and so on. Said she just didn't have any depth to her. Said, so she never prayed. And if you're a Carmelite nun, if you're not praying, you shouldn't be in a convent. Said, but she was always pleasant, and she said she was always aware of her own weakness. She never pretended to others or to herself that she was anything other than what she was. A mediocre nun. So then she got cancer. And so she realized she was dying, so she really tried in the last months of her life to bear down. I want to be serious, I want to pray, I want to become, but it didn't work. Said 60 years of bad habits, you don't just turn them around because you got cancer. Said, so she died the way she lived. Said, a thoroughly mediocre nun. This is Burroughs' commentary. Said, but she died a happy death. She died the death of a weak sinner asking God to forgive her for a life of weakness. She died a happy death. See, she died in honesty, you know. And then Burroughs says this, says, only a saint can afford a saint's death. And the rest of us need to go out in our own eyes, in the eyes of our families, of who we are. We're weak people, and God is okay with that, you know. See, it's not so much, does death catch you on an up bounce or a down bounce? Does death catch you honest? You know, we're not pretending. Now, the good news is, as Kathleen Dowling sings, says, death is the process of aging and dying is calibrated to bring us into honesty. You know, sooner or later, you know, it's going to get us. You know, it's interesting, and I'll end on this. Kathleen Dowling sings, says, the process of dying is calibrated to bring us into the realm of spirit in the same way as intense prayer is. See, when we pray, you know, in meditation and contemplation and centering prayer and so on, the function of that prayer is precisely to open us up to the realm of spirit, you know. But she says, since most people don't pray and don't have an intense prayer life, she says, God arranges it for you. And the good news is God is going to get you one way or the other. If you don't do it on your own, nature's going to do it to you. As I said this morning, Hillman says, nature is going to turn you all into a monk. Every one of us, if we live long enough, you know. So some turn themselves into monks by design, and some spend long hours in prayer to get into the realm of spirit. Most of us don't, so the process will do it for us. You know, it's interesting, she describes, she said friends who went to Buddhist monasteries in the East, in Asia, where they were submitted themselves to very, very long, intense periods of prayer, where they'd have to sit like for 11 or 12 hours without moving, and mosquitoes biting them, and they're hungry, and so on. And so one of her friends said, I wanted to scream in pain and in boredom. So just to sit like for 11 hours and you can't think. Said, I just wanted to scream in the pain and the boredom of it. Said, that's exactly what's happening in hospice. See, she is doing a hospice. You know, people in dying, they want to scream in agony, you know, and sometimes they do scream in agony. She says, see, that's opening you up to the realm of spirit. It's an old Jewish axiom. You know, they say, it's with much groaning of the flesh that the life of the spirit comes forth. See, and so Kathleen Dowling sings, you can do it through prayer. You can have a kind of spiritual life that gets you there. But if you don't have to worry about it. God's going to do it to you. Nature will do it to you. And God's going to turn you into contemplative. God's going to turn you into a monk, into a nun. God is going to turn you, is going to have you move into the realm of spirit. That's nature's intent. That's written into our DNA, and it's written into our religion. Thank you. We'll pick this up this afternoon.